Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Emily Ty, and welcome to another book talk sponsored by the CUNY Academy for the Humanities and the Sciences. This is a series available on Zoom and sometimes in person at the CUNY Graduate Center that features the research and achievements of our extraordinary faculty across the City University of New York. Today, we're delighted to have Dr. Kristina Baines, who earned her BA and MA from Florida Atlantic University and an MSc in medical anthropology from Oxford University in the United Kingdom, and then came back to our own United States for a PhD in applied anthropology from the University of South Florida. She's a professor of anthropology at Gutman Community College and affiliated faculty at the CUNY Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy. She's also the director of anthropology for the blog Cool Anthropology. Dr. Baines' first book, Embodying Ecological Heritage in a Maya Community, Health, Happiness, and Identity, which was from Rowan and Littlefield, Lexington Press back in 2015, provided an ethnographic account of life in a rural farming village in southern Belize. She's here today to discuss her most recent book, Heritage in the Body, Sensory Ecologies of Health Practice in Times of Change, from the University of Arizona Press. We'll be putting up a flyer with a discount for those of you who may wish to purchase the book, as well as links to some of Dr. Baines' materials. Dr. Baines, we're so grateful to have you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you for having me. Thanks to the CUNY Academy. Thank you to all of you for being here on a Wednesday afternoon at the end of the semester. I have prepared a couple of short readings from the book, and I wanted to talk through some of my process for writing the book, and then I hope that we'll have a good amount of time at the end for any comments and questions. For those of you that have checked it out already, for those of you that have more comments and questions based on what you hear today. I wanted to start out by saying that in writing this book, my goal was to write a book that both undergraduates and community members wanted to read and were excited to read, which means that I wanted it to be a very accessible book. And I think sometimes as academics, maybe particularly as anthropologists, we write in a very dense fashion, and our research is less than accessible to folks other than we're writing for each other, right? Other folks. So I wanted it to be a book that was kind of short, that could be read. The narrative voices of the community members came through, but it is undergirded with a very rigorous kind of academic foundation, which can be found in the footnotes. And so I read several books like this in the past, and I was really inspired to think through how you could read through a narrative, and undergraduates would read a whole book because I'm a teacher scholar. So my undergraduate was like, oh, I don't know if I can read a whole book. You know, can you condense that into a meme? And so I wanted to make a very readable, accessible book that could have a far reach with undergraduates and also with community members. So that said, I'm going to read a couple small excerpts and kind of talk through some of the themes in the book, and to give you an idea of how it reads, and also sort of to go a little deeper into some of the contents. All right. I think you'll miss this place. You're used to it now. Yes, I will come back, though. We'll see each other again. If we're still alive. Yes, if we're still alive. As I left Belize a few days before Christmas in 2001, I could already sense the changes I would later notice when I made my way back over the next months and years. The rock and mud road I had struggled to negotiate for months had been passed over and made smooth in preparation for paving. As I got into my truck and drove away, waving and weeping through the village, the road became increasingly easy to navigate as I hit the stretch that the paving project had already reached, and then the stretch to the coast that had been paved for years. The members of the Maya community, or had just left, were speculating about what would happen when the road was finished. What changes would it bring to their lives, to their community? Would it be good? Would it be bad? Chances are, a middle aged man said, it would be a little bit good. and a little bit bad. Whatever happened, they would handle it. They would adapt. As I drove swiftly through the East Indian community that proudly announces its ethnicity on its roadside sign, I considered how a road might affect practices, particularly defined as traditional or related to heritage, that I had just spent the previous 11 months studying. As soon as I reached the coast and turned to drive along it into the town, I noticed a small group of children playing in the shallows of the Caribbean Sea. The nearby dock was showing visible signs of age, wooden planks askew, and a solitary fishing boat was tied nearby. I had come to learn about Garifuna history and traditions from the little time I spent in the town, and I knew things were changing there too. While the road would make accessing natural resources in the interior Maya communities easier for those coming from outside, the resources and fishing areas frequented by Garifuna communities had been accessed by others for years. Everyone felt the changes, past and present, and we all wondered what the future would hold. Change as method. Change in many ways is an obvious focus of anthropological inquiry. The process of leaving and returning to a community makes changes noteworthy. The cautionary desire for anthropological research not to become a simple snapshot freezing communities in time makes addressing change critical. The palpable acceleration of global environmental and economic changes gives the research urgency. I did not set out to study change when I returned to Belize the next year or each year since, with the exception only of the 2020-2021 global pandemic. When I moved to New York City and reached out to Belizean communities there, I was not aiming to look at change, but people feel change. They talk about change. They live and practice through change. And thus, change becomes a useful lens through which to see and begin to understand the stories and experiences of the Maya and Garifuna communities that shared so much time and space with me over the last decade. It became clear that lived experiences of health, of heritage practices, of ecological systems and conditions were better illuminated through and impossible to disentangle from a consideration of change. And following this pathway emerging from and useful to communities reinforced the grounded approach to the research I'm committed to centering. Following the changes have allowed me the opportunity to conduct research across time and space, focusing on the relationship, building, and relational accountability critical for community-based research, particularly in Indigenous communities. All right, so that gives you an idea of where this book kind of takes up from the last book. And I wanted to just orient you, those of you who are not kind of oriented to where Belize is and what's happening in Belize and the kind of trajectory I took. This is a map on the left that appears in the book with some areas of interest. And the Maya community that I speak of, which was the subject of the research of my first book and some of this book, is in the south. So you can notice it on the left side, Santa Cruz with the ear of corn on the left-hand map on your screen. And the community members that I began to work with in New York City from Bed-Stuy that you'll hear about in a few minutes, they hail from Dangriga, which is up on the coast in the middle of the map on the left-hand side, and Punta Gorda, the town that I was driving to in that opening vignette, is you'll see on the coast in the south. So I'm working with Mopan and Kekchi Maya and Garifuna communities. And these are Indigenous communities in Belize. Belize is a very fascinating place. It's located in Central America, as you see, bordered by Mexico to the north and Guatemala to the west and the south. So there's many ethnicities in Belize, including the East Indian ethnicity that I mentioned, Creole being a dominant ethnicity in Belize, in addition to the Maya and Garifuna communities that I mentioned. It's unique in many ways as a Central American country. It was a British colony in the days of colonization. And so the English is the language of the like official language, although all the ethnicities and communities that I spoke about have their own languages that they speak. but the rest of Central America were Spanish colonies. And so that kind of sets it apart and kind of makes it more akin to some of the Caribbean islands. So it has a very Caribbean kind of bent to their thinking and thought processing. So it's sort of like at this intersection of Central American and Caribbean in terms of cultural background um, and perspective, I would say. All right. So the book goes back and forth between encounters in Belize and encounters in New York and Los Angeles, where people have moved. There's also encounters with folks from southern Belize, up in the north in Key-Cocker, which are the islands off the coast that you see towards the top of the map. So I ask the question about what happens in times of change, and I look at change from a broad perspective to include temporal change, change over time, spatial change, movement, right, to the United States, to Key-Cocker, and also climate change and economic change, which you'll hear a little bit more about. So that said, I would like to continue with my theoretical argument, I suppose. And how I begin my theoretical argument as my work begins with asking the question, what makes a healthy person? And um, and this is how I arrived at my framing and expanded on my theoretical framing based on this question. The way that community members spoke and conceptualized their health was intimately connected to how they spoke about being Maya or participating in traditional ecological practices. The relationship between health and what the Maya community members defined as heritage practices existed on many levels and incorporated ideas about food, work, and education. The connections were simultaneously physical, mental, and social, and the healthy body describes as that which could work and grow and prepare food in a traditional way. Their lived experience could be understood as embodied ecological heritage, which I'll talk about more. This lens is useful in describing health, and particularly communities that are not fully steeped in the legacy of Cartesian dualism. So for those of you that are not familiar with Descartes, he's the one who gave us Cartesian dualism, which is a separation of the body and mind, which I argue is not useful to anybody really, or especially to those of us working in Indigenous communities that are not steeped in that legacy. It is complementary to more politicized critical health perspectives, which highlight structural forces and impacts on health. Embodied ecological heritage is an important intervention in this perspective, as it allows the individual sensory experience to be understood in the context of both the physical and the social, which is an aspect of health understanding that receives little attention. Bodies change through everyday practices, and these changes matter for health. Embodied ecological heritage guides the understanding and explanation of these changes, illuminating the role of heritage practices in the maintenance of health. So I'm just going to kind of summarize with this slide here, where this is the way that I conceptualized heritage, and I just sort of introduced you to how I kind of came to think about embodied ecological heritage, or EEH, as my framework that I presented and have expanded upon in this book for understanding how heritage moves with us, right? So it's a practice and not a static list, and how that heritage in our body, in our practice, moving with us, is protective and helps us maintain health and wellness, which is the central argument in the book. And later I get on to sort of thinking through what that mechanism is, right? What the body is doing and how that helps us maintain health. A little bit more on the theoretical perspective, if I may. Embodied ecological heritage brings together seemingly disparate theories about the way in which anthropologists have historically understood bodies and bodily practice. Phenomenology, which is sort of the mother perspective of this framework, seeks to capture being in the world, the lived and embodied experience felt through action or practice. This perspective has been set in contrast with more cognitive theoretical orientations, which aim to capture the internal structures of the mind and how they classify external factors they encounter. In my work and through the development of EEH, I argue that these orientations need not be in opposition. Through a focus on how sensory experiences change the body, including the brain, right? We're putting those together. Remember Descartes, or don't remember Descartes. EEH reveals how how phenomenological and cognitive perspectives can coexist. Cognitive phenomenology, as a theoretical orientation, shows heritage is not static, not a list of traditional plants or foods, not simply knowledge stored in the brain, rather, something that is carried in the body. Embodied ecological heritage is a grounded theory. That means people speak about their heritage in terms of practice and what they do with their bodies and how those practices relate to how they feel. The language of those sensory experiences, the smells, tastes, sounds, feelings of doing and being in the world, is rich with connections to tradition, to heritage, identity, to health. Documenting and understanding these connections, how these connections happen, and how they form in a critical way of not only being well in, but also in thinking about the world is vital. All right, so hopefully that gives you a strong framing of which to kind of think through um, how these stories are presented in the book, and how I'm thinking about heritage and health through the body in this very holistic or kind of all-encapturing way. And I just want to stop here for a moment. I have some stories to tell you about people who taught me a lot. But I just want to stop and say that a lot of times when people are thinking about embodied ecological heritage, they're like, okay, so this is sort of, social health. Or but is it physical health or is it mental health? So it's social and mental health. And the idea behind thinking through this is that it kind of disappears those distinctions between mental and physical and social, right? So these things are layered on top of each other in ways that they kind of become a holistic framework for thinking about how we conceptualize being a healthy person. All right, let me tell you about these ladies. My mom don't like pills, that's why she's 96. I was sitting in a comfortable leather recliner in the living room of a well-appointed home in Bedford's Stuyvesant neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York City. Rosita Alvarez was talking about her mother, Marciana, who lived until very recently in Dangriga, a larger coastal town just to the north of Hopkins in the Stand Creek district of Belize. She spoke about the traditional medicinal practices she learned from her many of which she uses in Brooklyn, where biomedicine is the norm. Rosita leads a cultural group centered around local Catholic Church and is dedicated to promoting both Pan-Garifuna and Pan-Belizean identity and culture. It is a central part of her life and brings her much joy as well as a certain amount of frustration. It's not easy. A lot of people who have come to the States are more American into the more American way of life. I do understand because this is where they live. Everybody won't adapt to this way, the way that they do. Some of us remain here. We live here. This is a Garifuna house. We live here. We speak Garifuna. But others, maybe they can't. Maybe they're not interested. This is a tension that Rosita and I have revisited several times as our relationship has deepened. In this conversation, one of many in which she has outlined the many ways of being Garifuna is linked to leading a good, healthy life. She explained how she and the members of the New York City Garifuna community access the botanical materials, natural herbs and roots used in medicinal teas and topical preparations in the urban metropolis. She signaled for me to wait in my comfortable seat and went to the pantry to retrieve a plastic bag. She opened it to reveal a pile of reddish-brown roots brought from Belize. When prepared, they comprise a medicinal brew used to cleanse the blood. The community, she explained, shares information about which Korean stores in the neighborhood carry the herbs that they would normally grow and harvest in Belize. Rosita buys lemongrass from the store right by her subway entrance. Ginger, allspice, and cinnamon are also purchased and used to maintain the health of bodily systems. I remarked that I learned a lot about the plants of Belize that are used in everyday medicinals from Maya communities. Lemongrass for a cough or fever, allspice leaves for weddings and special ceremonies, bitter vines and roots for cleansing the blood. She nodded, slinging that these practices were well known among other communities as well. Maintaining Garifuna identity through traditional practices, both in Belize and Brooklyn, meant valuing how other traditional communities shared and maintained knowledge. In the context of the fears and cautions of a homogenizing, globalizing world, we shared a quiet acknowledgement that it is not just international pharmaceutical and technology companies driving cultural practice. She and other Indigenous leaders and community members are driving it with their bodies in everyday practice. All right, so you see here, just to kind of draw your attention to the photographs that you see in front of you. Maybe I'll just go back a second and say that Rosita on the left here is holding a traditional coconut grater. I think some people are interested in what that is. So coconut is a very important contribution to Garifuna cooking, and this is a grater made with shells embedded in the wood here. And then this is her mother. May she rest in peace. She passed away at age 100 a year and a half ago. And then these are the roots that I was talking about, the barks on the upper left. That's the Korean store under the subway in Brooklyn. And then we have some of the other botanicals. The bottom right corner photograph I like to draw attention to, because this is sort of a reimagining and repackaging of traditional herbs in kind of cute hipster baskets by the young Garifuna community, which brings me pleasure. All right. So I'd like to move on to the next chapter now, where I think through some of what's going on in the Maya community as it relates to embodied heritage as well. They don't know how to thatch anymore. They're going to school and they don't want to give free labor anymore. Susano's complaints about the younger generation take a similar tone to that of grandparents around the world, a bemoaning of the changes they see in the youth, a nostalgic callback to all that was better before those changes. In this case, all my time spent in southern Belize has taught me that the loss of the reciprocal labor system is actually quite rightly cause for concern. It is not just the elders who discuss the value of reciprocity. Working together to plant and harvest corn, cook meals for celebrations, and build houses is the traditional practice that provides central social and economic benefits critical to a healthy Maya life. While the reciprocal labor system, in which community members provide a day of work for their neighbors on request, and those neighbors owe them a day of labor in the future, is what people generally mean when they use the English phrase working together. This practice has come to symbolize not just the embodied practice, but a wider acknowledgement of the wider Maya values related to collective decision-making and rotating community leadership. As the village governance process interfaces with those of the nation state, Maya leaders have made a concerted effort to strengthen this collectivist approach. So I'll continue with another vignette, another conversation with a different farmer. The images that you see are illustrations of the collective reciprocal labor process that you see. So the cahoon leaves in the upper left corner have been harvested by members of the community who have been called upon to thatch a new house, a thatch house, of which is being built with the sticks that you see in the bottom left corner. And then on the right, these are men going to chop in order to prepare land for the planting of corn, which is a central traditional activity and a central activity for life in southern Belize in my communities. A little bit more about the planting of corn in this vignette. I later sat discussing the intersection of technology, tradition, and health with a young farmer who had planted hybrid corn seeds for about 5 years. He told me that he did not see anything wrong with burning incense while you planted corn seeds, that he understood that it was a tradition that the old people liked to do, that it was not bad or negative practice, even though his Baptist church would deem it such. But he would not bother doing it because it does not actually do anything. It does not actually make the corn healthier. He chuckled, his smile tinged with a knowing glance, shared with me, as he assumed I would agree, that the agricultural science around corn crop success has nothing to do with burning incense. I was not as sure as he assumed I was. While I had not engaged in the systematic assessment of corn yields in relation to the ritual practices traditionally associated with planting, I had assessed the significance of burning incense to the overall wellness of individuals and families who engaged in that practice. And it was significant. Burning incense was actually one of the most significant practices linked to wellness. If it had the potential to increase wellness in the people involved in the planting and tending and processing of the corn, it follows that it may possibly increase the health of the corn itself. I did not tease out the particular mechanisms of the embodied practice, the sensory pathway through which the smell of the incense is processed through the hippocampus and invokes memories which are processed in the same part of that brain, the inskilling of the farmers and the embodied knowledge that they carried with them could clearly be linked to the activation of those memories in the brain through this process. Thus, the ritual associated with the planting, which included the burning of incense, was critical to activating the farmers in such a way that they would become more likely to plant a successful field of corn. All right. So you have some idea of the kinds of community members and the conversations and the way those are structured in the book, and how I'm learning through conversation with community members and the way the research is expressed. I actually have, papers that you can access and that are in the footnotes of the book where people can think through the p-values of the association with incense and wellness in the community. So those also exist. But the way that I've structured the book, and this is a question I get all the time, the one that you see on your screen right here is but are they actually healthier? And so I said when I introduced embodied ecological heritage that this provides a pathway, right, to how people are actually healthier, how bodies actually change through their engagement, through these heritage practices. So this isn't just something that is imagined or something that is mental as divorced from the physical body, but um, they are actually healthier. And so I've been thinking through a little bit of how the mechanism of the sensory works, right? So when you smell or when you have a sensory experience as part of your lived experience in the world, that changes your body. It changes your brain. It's processing your brain in different ways and kind of changes the way that your physical body interacts with the world and is part of your ecological system. So one of the ideas that comes up in the book a lot that I play with when I'm talking through or writing through the sensory mechanism for wellness, for bodily change, is this idea of boiling. So boiling becomes a very, very important part of one of the ways in which I feel like these sensory connections are made, right? So you see some traditional um, soups from the Maya and Garifuna communities on your screen. On the right, you see caldo being made. This is part of the traditional practice of the planting and the making of the houses, the slides that you saw earlier. This traditional soup is made in community. Um, and the tortillas are made in community, as you see on the lower part of that image. And then the lower left, you see a picture of hadut, which is a Garifuna soup made with the coconut that I mentioned earlier. And that's boiling on a stove in Brooklyn, and boiling some corn in the upper left corner too. All right. All right. So I just want to, that's a little tease of the conclusions, but I'm actually going to provide you now with a spoiler. So if you don't want to know the end of the book and what the conclusions I draw are, so mute me now, because these are the spoilers. The conclusions and beginnings, I call this section. Through the gathering of these stories, I was changed. My notebooks were full, but I had indeed learned with my body. Through the sharing of these stories, I have aimed to honor that learning in both celebration and critique, by way of both summary and introduction to these concluding thoughts. This is what the Belizean, Maya, and Garifuna communities living in times of change, which is always, have taught me. Tradition is not static or archaic, but nuanced and negotiated, embodied and lived in the everyday. Traditional practice is not a rejection of change or of modernity. Traditional is a word used by communities to describe a wide range of practices, and as such, is a useful classificatory tool. Traditional practices are linked to health. Health is holistic. Assumptions about traditional healing systems and their clashes with science or biomedical models contain false dichotomies. And this is what I have learned from these lessons. Phenomenological perspectives and sensory experiences can be scientifically understood, even if we're still honing the tools to measure them. Sensory experiences act upon the physical body. The mind is part of the body. The body is part of a community and the entire ecological system. Inherent in this argument is a critique of biomedicine, of biopower, but not a rejection of it. Inherent in this argument is a critique of global development thinking, which privileges biomedicine and other associated ways of being in the world as more aspirational and more valid than others. Inherent in this argument is an economic critique, a critique of capital and of the resultant health disparities, of hyper-individualism, and the supremacy of individual bodies. Traditional practices often mean collective practice. Community-focused therapeutic practice can go some distance to heal collective trauma associated with being Indigenous, with being marginalized, with being colonized, and with the ongoing challenges and dismissal of your belief systems. Foremost, I have learned that change is hard, but that life continues in ways that are rich and beautiful. The stories I have gathered here are not simply a critique of global forces or hegemonic systems. They are also a celebration of the joys and discoveries of daily life in the midst of inevitable and ongoing changes. All right, thank you, and pardon me. And I would love to hear your comments or questions related to anything you've heard or anything that you've seen or read. I just put the images of two dances that are still currently going on that have, remarkable similarities in terms of their relationship to the colonization process and the white masks that you see in both of these dances. Thank you all. Thank you for being here. Thank you for to all of these folks. Thank you to Emily. I don't know if anybody has any questions. You have some information that you'll put in the chat, or I can look at the chat as well.
The information's already in the chat, but we're open to questions now. I have one quickie, which is one of your last photos is them dancing in City Hall. So is the diaspora community in Bedford-Stuy at all politically active in terms of representation in New York?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I would say that most of the activation of the Belizean Garifuna community in Bed-Stuy is through sort of church the churches in Bed-Stuy. The folks that are dancing here are from. They invited me though to this this event which honors Garifuna entrepreneurs in the city, and the contributions of Garifuna folks in the city. The dancers are from the Bronx. There's a big community in the Bronx of Garifuna community members from Honduras. Many of them hail from Honduras originally, and um, there's an activation there. So I think this is sort of a civic activation, and not that there's no Garifuna representation
Mhm.
in the city council, but
I imagine there would be actually if they're in the Bronx and Bed-Stuy. I have a follow-up question,
sure.
which is, you mentioned their connection to the Caribbean. And as I was looking at the guinea hen and the ginger, I was seeing many familiar things from Jamaica, which is where my husband's from. And I was wondering, uh, when you talk about them being an indigenous Maya community, obviously that has deep roots in the locus of Central America. But it feels to me like if Belize was a British colony, they're also part of a larger sort of South Asian diaspora that also influenced some of this medical practice because some indigenous medical practices also go back to China. And there's so much back and forth in terms of migrant labor in the 19th century. So I was wondering, um, do the Garifuna understand their practices as being exclusively Mayan from one group, or do they see any diaspora roots within a larger Caribbean community?
I would say that so the Garifuna. I think it's a really interesting question, actually, because I presented some of this research in relation to as part of an Eastern medicines and religions panel, and we saw a lot of parallels between the different plants that were used in Chinese medicine in different kinds of ways, although maybe different parts of the plant are used. And there is a big Chinese community currently in Belize as well. However, I would say that the way I would interpret them are adaptations to um, to which particular latitude line, right? So a particular environment or ecological environment that includes the availability of certain plants, right? Um, Maya and Garifuna folks haven't they don't know that they recognize a necessarily a common um, sort of medicinal history, although they recognize the, as I was saying in the reading, they recognize this overlapping um, uses, right? So I don't know if they would trace them to a single origin, although there's many Garifuna community members. So the Garifuna are trace their roots to Carib and Arawak native peoples of the Caribbean, and they have West African ancestry together. And from Saint Vincent, they're originally from Saint Vincent. They were ousted in a British colonial genocide of 1797 and scattered around the Caribbean coast of Central America. Um, in different, so they've been an indigenous community of Belize for many years. Um, so I think that some of the traditions would be considered as brought from Saint Vincent, right? In response to the ecological environments of Saint Vincent. Although I have visited Saint Vincent, I talk a little bit about that in the book, and some of the medicinals are found there for sure. Um, that people use, and some things like cerasee. Um, Here, I think I have a picture actually of cerasee in St. Vincent, which is this herb on the left side here. Um, this is Rosita again in St. Vincent, kind of returning to her roots and finding this plant that I just actually saw growing in Woodside, Queens. Um, but it's a tropical plant that was found in St. Vincent, and was very a source of much excitement, right? Because it's not something that people have a lot of access to in Brooklyn. I don't know if that sort of answers your question, I think.
Hmm. Well, everyone knows Queens is the navel of the world. Uh, so especially Woodside. Um, so we're opening it up to questions. Are there other questions for Dr. Baines? You can unmute your mic. You can also show your camera if you wish.
If nobody has a question right now, I actually have it's while you guys are formulating, because I hope you do have a question. I just want to mention that Cynthia Fowler and her students that are listening, um, I just noticed you there, is one of the editors of the series, which this book is part of, which is called Global Health, Global Change. And there's many other, if you're interested in global health and global change and in environmental health intersections, the University of Arizona Press, um, since Sissy Fowler and Liz Olson and now Janelle Baker are amazing editors of the series, and there's lots of other um, great books in the series too. So if you read this book and you love it and you really think that this is an intersection that you're very interested in for your own work or your own interest or your own being in the world, so thank you. A special thank you to Sissy. Okay. I'm sorry. I don't know if I cut anybody off. I apologize. It's harder to see. I should maybe stop sharing my screen.
It seems like Dr. Fowler is also watching with her students.
Yes.
So yes, if anybody else has a question, please share it. We imagine these spaces as inclusive of not just faculty, but also our undergraduate and graduate uh, affiliates.
I have a question.
Please.
Do you see any parallels between the East Indian civilization and the Mayan civilization?
Any parallels in southern Belize?
Mayan in general,
Mhm.
are there any similarities between Indian civilization, East Indian civilization, and the Mayan?
Yes, I would say that, I don't have I haven't worked extensively with the East Indian community in Belize or in India or the diaspora, but in Belize, the East Indian community members that I've come into contact with through my many years of research there are similar plants that are used, similar values of working together that show up. So I think that there are kind of certainly similarities. In Belize, they grow a lot of turmeric, which they call yellow
Mhm.
ginger, which the East Indian community utilizes a lot of, and I
Right.
think that there's a taste for yellow ginger that comes from the East Indian community that has that Maya people have incorporated. There's also sort of low-level economic initiatives that are shared by all community members. So Maya communities may grow yellow ginger, and East Indian communities may do the same, and they might work in the processing and sale of turmeric, of yellow ginger, as an example of one of the ways in which um, there's sort of similar heritage practices that occur. So
The reason for my question was I read somewhere prior to the Ice Age, there was a migration from India uh, to the southern, um, to the west coast of the United States
oh
and
wow.
Central America. I read somewhere. That's why I asked that question.
Oh, okay. Wow, that's interesting. My archaeological or my ancient um, heritage knowledge is relatively limited. Just being a
Mhm.
cultural anthropologist and working with living people, I am interested in histories and the way people sort of trace their heritage traditions. Obviously, I'm interested in heritage, but in as much as they think about them um, as informing their present practice. So I'm sure there's many scholars who could speak to that in a much more informed way, but I appreciate the question very much.
Thank you.
Oh, I can see the students.
Anybody raising a hand? Yes,
Oh my
groovy.
God, we have lots of them. Are you
Please.
listening, or are you raising your hands to talk?
Yes.
We're waiting.
Oh, well, it's wonderful to have you all here. Do any of you have any questions?
Thank you. We really enjoyed it. And a lot of the things that you touched on relate to what we're learning in Anthropology 101, particularly with the medical anthropology chapter and the ecological anthropology chapter. And yeah, so thank you so much for letting us sit in on your book talk.
Thank you so much for being here. Is there anything that was unclear? Anything I can clarify for anybody?
I have a question.
Hi.
Please.
First of all, thank you, Kristina. It was such a good talk, and your book sounds so fascinating. I'm excited to read it. I was really curious about how, like, over your years of working in this community and doing your research, like how much climate collapse and just like environmental changes and the vulnerabilities of, being in this particular area, like how that's shaping like their cultural practices, like how they respond to those changes, if you've observed that or kind of written about that in your work. I'm just curious how, yeah, that's shaped like foodways or the way that they're like the materials they're using and sourcing for that are meaningful for cultural practices. Yeah, how much like climate collapse is changing that or not.
Yeah, that's a great question. Absolutely. I do address climate in chapter 4 a little as people talk to me about it, right? And the latest, so Maya communities in southern Belize historically practice slash and burn or swidden agriculture, which is like this a shifting cultivation where they would slash with a machete a piece of the forest, plant corn and associated crops, beans, and other kinds of traditional crops, and then allow that piece of land to go fallow for 7 years and regenerate. And there's no irrigation that's practiced, right? So rainfall pattern changes is something that several researchers have been working on because people in the community talk about the rains coming at a different time, the storms intensifying and winds blowing down a corn crop. And if you lose your main corn crop, which is typically planted in May, there's a second one in October, but the big one in May, if the rains don't come in May, right, if the climate is changing and things are shifting, then that has pretty intense implications, right? There was recently an issue with fire and the dryness of the rain not coming and the fires that are used to clear the land getting out of control and not being contained in traditional ways like they used to. So there's lots of folks coming in and saying, hey, you need to change your slash and burn practice because it's too dry and it's not working in the same kind of way. And I would say that like Maya farmers are very open to the heritage being fluid, right? So that there's a practice called slash and mulch, which I talk about in the book, where one of the farmers that is kind of like always on sort of the forefront of like, oh, let's try something, these kind of new changes. Instead of burning, is mulching the land, and that retains moisture, and so it's less susceptible to a lack of rain. So climate developments are definitely changing. There's initiatives where people are like, well, maybe you should plant a cash crops like cacao, which is a traditional plant that grows very well, and but it's not just for ritual practice or daily sustenance, but also for cash and like replacing corn with cacao because it's more sort of an agroforestry crop and maybe more sustainable in terms of the shifting climates. And people are open, I would say, to that. But people are nervous, they're worried, right? Because I think that like planting corn in the traditional way with the slash and burn agriculture is something it's not just provides the bulk of the sustenance, right? Bulk of food to keep people going, but it's also part of like this daily heritage practice that keeps them well, right? The action of going to the farm and working collectively on, to clear it and harvesting and preparing in that way, and the time is part of the rhythm of life that keeps people well. So I guess the short answer is yes, people are talking about that. People are attempting to measure that. People are adapting, but they kind of have an attitude like, okay, I guess, we'll figure it out. It's kind of a gradual thing. Something I do write about in the book is that people have come and said to the community and said, you can't burn because burning creates climate change. And so they're like, we have to stop our traditional practice because we're causing climate change. And I'm like, okay, I'm not a climate scientist, but you guys are not causing global climate change, the handful of farmers in southern Belize. So that's something that, we have to address that narrative of cause, but they definitely are, there's a vulnerability. Which I feel like there's a lot of resilience and adaptation. So I don't like to overstate the vulnerability, but absolutely, anybody that's sort of reliant on climate processes for irrigation and things. Thank you. Sorry, long-winded.
No, thank you. That's super interesting.
Well, it speaks to what you were talking about earlier about the idea that this is about negotiation, that agriculture is a sort of the organic process and they're used to working with the land. It's just that corn was working for a really long time. So switching over is difficult. Do they, in Belize, gain any advantage from the tourist industry or sustainable tourism or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I guess the answer is, well, in Belize, yes, right? Tourism is a huge and promoted part of economic, the economics of Belize and growth of Belize. The intersection of Maya and Garifuna communities with tourism is a little bit, a lot has been written about it. And most recently from Maya communities themselves. So I didn't really mention this in the talk. I do talk about it in many papers that I've written in a little bit in the book about the Maya community in southern Belize, where this research started. They were the first in the world to use the UN Declaration for Rights of Indigenous Peoples to have the title to their land, right? So that the government doesn't hold the title to their land. But they for their traditional agricultural practices and the way that the community organization works, self-governance is really critical, and their ability to manage their own land is critical. And they had a long fought, which is still underway. They do have they were given the rights to their land, but they're still they're figuring out how to have the titles and actually to make that the legal process is not complete, I suppose, is what I want.
Yeah, well, presumably, yes.
So these community, remind me again, Emily, I was circling back with the Maya.
Well, I mean, it sounds like it's a little bit like your colleague who talked about, well, the road is built and some things will be good and some things will be bad.
Right. So I think like the government of Belize, right, wants to kind of use ancient Maya images, and then even Maya images now of like, folks grinding cacao and those kinds of things to encourage tourism. But the archaeological sites are managed by the government and not by the Maya people. And so there's a quite rightly an objection that manifests in various kinds of ways about using Maya heritage and Maya people to encourage tourists to come that may intersect with non-Maya streams of income,
mhm,
right? So
mhm,
there are more and more Maya tour guides and more sort of like village experiences, and more Garifuna folks also that are involved in tourism as well. So these sort of traditional tourist
mhm, mhm.
activities
Right.
haven't traditionally been in control of the communities that tourists want to kind of
Mhm,
be, which is an old story, I think, for
mhm.
Indigenous communities. But there's a lot of activism
Yeah, I
within
would
the movement
expect.
that
Mhm,
is trying to right some of those wrongs in terms of tourism. But a
mhm,
lot of people go to the coast. In chapter 2, I talk about a farmer who gets his tourist license, and he goes to Key Cocker to be a snorkel guide for tourists coming to snorkel on the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef
mhm,
in Belize. And so I do engage with the changes that tourism and the tourist opportunities bring,
mhm,
um,
mhm, mhm,
so,
mhm,
and the training, the increased training of Maya and
mhm,
community members in
mhm, mhm.
tourism practice.
Yes. Okay. So are there any more questions from anyone still logged on? I know I see a few thanks in the chat, not just from Dr. Fowler, but also from Maggie Jack and Emma Tadani. And I want to remind anybody else before they log off that we have a flyer that's uploaded for anyone who wants to acquire the book with a discount. There are links to Dr. Baines' own website as well as to coolanthropology.com. I think we've all had an hour of cool anthropology with Dr. Baines. Um,
Thank you so much, Emily. I appreciate everybody who attended and who supported the book. Special thanks, of course, to you, Emily, for organizing, and the CUNY Academy for having me. I really appreciate it.
well, I'd like to thank you all for attending on behalf of the CUNY Academy for the Humanities and the Sciences. Dr. Baines will be making this recording available to you in case you wish to share it with any colleagues or students. Unless there are any other questions, I'd like to thank you all for being here and our very best wishes for a good afternoon.